Maybe she's here for a selfie in the cockpit. Get a good angle for Instagram. One instructor smirked, drawing laughter. Claire Weston said nothing. She set down her bag, folded her hands, and stared beyond the heat-shimmering tarmac, still as stone. The desert heat wavered like molten glass. She sat quietly, boots planted, the picture of calm in a storm of mockery. But when Air Marshal Kane drew closer, he spotted it, the faded tattoo behind her ear. His breath caught. The room fell silent. That mark wasn't decoration. It belonged to missions that never officially happened, to a pilot who wasn't meant to survive. In that instant, they knew. They hadn't mocked a woman, they had mocked Valkyrie 1. Stay with us. What happens next will change how you see heroes forever. Claire Weston wasn't the type of person you noticed at first glance. In a crowd, she blended in. Average height, sun-worn skin, dark hair usually tied back in a simple ponytail. No flashy medals pinned to her chest. No swagger in her walk. But those who had served alongside her knew Claire was anything but ordinary. Born in a small town in Montana, Claire grew up with the endless sky above her and the roar of crop dusters flying low over golden fields. She learned to love flight before she even learned to drive. Her father, a Vietnam veteran turned bush pilot, taught her how to handle a stick and rudder by age 13. By 18, she was flying supply runs to remote communities, mastering landings on dirt strips no wider than a two-lane road. When 9/11 happened, Claire didn't hesitate. She enlisted, determined to serve the country that had given her family so much. But she didn't want the predictable path. She didn't want to ferry supplies or fly transport planes. Claire wanted to be where the stakes were highest, where skill could mean the difference between life and death. That hunger led her to the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers. The regiment that took on the missions no one talked about, that operated in the shadows where maps ended. Her call sign, Valkyrie 1. Over the years, Claire flew missions that never made the news. Insertions deep behind enemy lines. Extractions under fire in valleys too narrow for helicopters to fit. Except she made it fit. She flew through dust storms, threaded canyons in moonless nights, and brought home soldiers who'd already been counted among the lost. But that came at a price. There was a mission, one they called Objective Red Sand, in the few debriefings that ever existed. The details were buried under layers of classification. A valley in the Hindu Kush, a team pinned down by insurgents, no way out. Satellite data said extraction was impossible. Claire disagreed. She threaded her Apache through mountain passes that didn't exist on official maps, flying so low that her rotors kicked up rocks the size of grapefruits. She got them out, every last one, but not without cost. Her co-pilot, Josh Tanner, a kid with quick wit and quicker reflexes, took a round through the cockpit. Claire managed to keep the bird flying to get them back to the base, but Josh didn't make it. His blood stained the seat next to hers, a mark no amount of scrubbing could erase. After that mission, Claire walked away from active service. Officially, she retired. Unofficially, she disappeared. The war had ended for her, but not inside her. She carried it in the nightmares that woke her before dawn, in the silence she kept even among friends, in the weight she felt every time she saw a folded flag. And now, years later, she had returned to Falcon Mesa. Not for glory, not to prove anything. She had made a promise. Josh's son was graduating flight school next month, a boy who had his father's eyes, his father's grin. Claire had sworn at Josh's grave that she would take one last flight before that day came. Not for closure, there was no such thing, but to remind herself that she could still fly, that she could still touch the sky without falling apart. So she came quietly, paperwork in hand, no fanfare, no expectation, just a pilot keeping a promise. A woman carrying memories that weighed more than any duffel on her shoulder. A warrior whose greatest battle was no longer in the sky, but within herself. Inside the operations tent at Falcon Mesa, the air was thick with heat and something sharper. Arrogance. Two flight instructors lounged behind a battered folding table, boots propped up like they owned the place. A few junior mechanics and cadets hung nearby, eager to absorb any crumb of approval. The atmosphere hummed with easy confidence, the kind that comes from never having been tested in ways that leave scars. Claire Weston approached quietly. She wasn't wearing a uniform. No insignia, no rank, no outward sign of belonging, just worn desert boots, faded cargo pants, and a plain olive shirt. Her hair was tied back, practical, no nonsense. She offered no speech, no explanation, only the folded authorization papers in her hand. The first instructor took one glance at the paperwork, then at Claire, and smirked. Loud enough for everyone to hear, he said, "Maybe she's here for a selfie in the cockpit. Gotta impress the followers, right?" Laughter rippled through the room. That easy, dismissive kind of laughter that feeds off the approval of the group. Claire said nothing. She placed her duffel on the ground, folded her hands, and stared out toward the tarmac, where the heat shimmered like molten glass. Still as stone, but silence wasn't enough. They wanted a reaction. She probably binge-watched Top Gun and thought she'd give it a try. Another instructor added, elbowing his buddy. Next, she'll want a call sign. How about Maverick Mom? Or maybe she's writing a blog, chimed in the protein shake guy, who hadn't stopped flexing since she walked in. Military wife tries combat flying. Clickbait gold. More laughter. The cadets grinned, relieved that the attention wasn't on them. The mechanics shifted uncomfortably, caught between the urge to join in and the sense that something wasn't right. "She's been out there for an hour, just sitting," one instructor boasted later in the break room, turning the story into legend already. Like she could will herself into the cockpit just by staring at it. What none of them saw, or cared to see, was the patience in Claire's stillness. The way she sat as if she'd learned, long ago, how to wait in silence when waiting was a matter of survival. Her hands rested lightly, ready to move at a moment's notice, but for now, at peace. Her breathing was measured, steady. She wasn't waiting for permission. She was keeping a promise. This moment wasn't just about Claire. It was about all of us, about how quick we are to judge based on the surface. In life, how often do we measure a person's worth by their uniform, their title, their age, their appearance? How often do we mistake quiet competence for weakness or loud confidence for ability? These instructors, these young cadets, they thought they were in control of the narrative because they saw what they wanted to see. A woman, civilian clothes, no visible rank. Therefore, she must not belong. Therefore, it's safe to mock. But they weren't seeing her. They weren't seeing the weight she carried, the miles she'd flown, the people she'd saved, or the ghosts that followed her into every dawn. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. On one side, the instructors in their easy mockery, a kind of confidence that feeds on exclusion, on making sure someone else is on the outside looking in. Their bravado was loud, performative, and hollow. They mistook their safe little corner of the world for the whole battlefield. On the other side, Claire Westin. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to flash credentials or demand respect. Her confidence was the quiet kind, forged in places these men couldn't imagine, where arrogance gets people killed and humility saves lives. Her strength came not from tearing others down, but from knowing in her bones what she was capable of and what she'd already survived. True ability doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need to announce itself with noise. It just is. And that's what made their mockery so empty. They couldn't see the truth, even as it sat right in front of them. A young mechanic walked past, tool bag slung over one shoulder. She paused, noticing Claire's stillness, the way she seemed to merge with the heat in the landscape. "Ma'am, you okay?" she asked, genuine concern softening her voice. Claire opened her eyes. "Just waiting." The girl nodded, but she glanced back twice as she walked on, uneasy. Something about the scene didn't add up. The woman in the chair didn't look lost or out of place. She looked like someone waiting for the moment when the world would finally catch up. Back in the tent, the instructors kept at it. "Probably flew drones from an air-conditioned trailer," one said. "Now thinks she's ready for the real thing." "Fixing motorcycles doesn't make you an Apache pilot," another added, as if he'd won the argument. And still Claire sat, still as stone. The storm of mockery swirled around her, but it never touched her, because Claire knew something they didn't. It's not the noise that matters. It's what you do when the noise stops. The door at the rear of the operations tent opened with a soft creak that no one noticed. No one except Claire. She didn't turn, didn't shift, but something in her posture adjusted ever so slightly, as if some deeply honed instinct recognized a change in the air. Air Marshal David Kane stepped inside. He wasn't a man who needed to announce himself. The quiet authority in his movements did that for him. His uniform, though clean, bore the subtle signs of a man who still worked, not just inspected: creases where a sidearm had rested, faint sun bleach along the collar. His boots were dusty from the tarmac, not polished for show. Kane had come to Falcon Mesa on what was supposed to be a routine inspection. Tick boxes, shake hands, nod at simulators he'd seen a dozen times before. But as soon as he crossed the threshold of that tent, he sensed something was off. The laughter, the posturing, the cadets and instructors too absorbed in their own performance to notice him. He paused, arms crossed, letting the scene play out. "Probably thinks that tattoo behind her ear makes her tough," one of the instructors snorted, earning another ripple of laughter. That's when Kane's eyes narrowed. A tattoo? He followed the instructor's glance toward the woman seated at the edge of the tent. His gaze took in the details others had missed. The way she sat, not slouched or restless, but perfectly still, hands folded, shoulders relaxed yet alert. A stillness that spoke of long hours in dangerous places where unnecessary motion could cost lives. And then he saw it, the small black mark, mostly hidden by her tied-back hair, just behind her left ear. A design faded to charcoal with age but unmistakable to anyone who'd served where Kane had. Two rotors crossed behind a dagger, minimalist, precise, and beneath it, tiny numbers that most would miss unless they knew to look. 160. Kane's breath caught in his throat. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers. But more than that, his sharp eyes picked up the secondary mark below the rotors, a symbol so rare, so classified, most people would dismiss it as meaningless. But Kane knew. He knew what it meant, and he knew that only one person alive was authorized to wear it: Valkyrie 1. He stared at her, suddenly seeing the truth behind the plain clothes, the silence, the patience. This wasn't some amateur chasing a fantasy. This wasn't a tourist angling for a selfie. This was a pilot whose missions hadn't existed on paper, whose flights had saved lives no one could ever publicly thank her for. This was a woman who had flown into places where maps ended and enemy fire was a certainty. A woman the world had quietly let fade into myth because her story was too complicated, too inconvenient, and these fools were mocking her. Kane's expression darkened. The instructors, sensing something shift in the air, fell quiet. Even the cadets straightened in their chairs, glancing uneasily at the newcomer. Without a word, Kane turned and strode back outside, the dust crunching under his boots. He moved with purpose, crossing the yard to the flight operations chief's station. "Get the Apache simulator prepped," he said quietly. "Full capabilities. No restrictions." "Sorry," the chief blinked. "Sir, civilian?" "She's not a civilian," Kane cut in, voice like steel. "And she doesn't need training wheels." The chief hesitated a beat, then nodded, keying the command into the system. Kane returned to the tent, and this time all eyes were on him. "Which one of you turned her away?" he asked, voice low but carrying weight that made backs straighten and hearts skip. One of the instructors raised his hand sheepishly, his earlier swagger gone. Kane's gaze swept the group, cold and unforgiving. "You've been mocking someone whose boots you're not fit to clean. That woman out there. She's Valkyrie 1. She's flown missions you'll never even hear about. And while you were busy trying to look important, she was busy being important." The tent was silent now. Even the AC seemed to hum more quietly. Without another word, Kane turned to Claire. She met his gaze evenly. No surprise, no smugness. Just that quiet patience. "The sim's ready for you, ma'am," Kane said with the kind of respect that comes from knowing the measure of a person. Claire stood, shouldered her duffel, and offered a small nod. "Thank you, sir." As they walked toward the hangar, the instructors and cadets watched in stunned silence. The mockery was over. The lesson had just begun. The heavy door to the simulator hangar groaned as it swung open, the blast of cool, recycled air hitting Claire and Kane like a blessing after the furnace heat outside. The cavernous space was dim, lit mostly by the soft glow of monitors and the cold gleam of the Apache simulator. sleek, black, coiled like a predator at rest. Claire paused for a breath, not because she doubted, but because she respected the moment. The familiar scent of hydraulic fluid, oil, and metal filled her lungs. Kane watched her, saying nothing. He didn't need to. He understood. She climbed into the cockpit with a grace that came from thousands of hours in the seat. No wasted motion, no hesitation. Her hands found the straps, the controls, the switches, as if no time had passed. The world outside, the instructors, the cadets, their mockery, fell away. Here, it was just Claire and the machine. As the simulator powered up, the wraparound screens flickered to life. A digital landscape bloomed around her. Jagged peaks, winding valleys, a pale dawn sky tinged with red. Afghanistan, or something close enough to stir ghosts. Claire's fingers danced across the console, flipping switches, adjusting trim. The familiar hum of systems coming online filled the space, a sound that once meant the difference between life and death. The rotor blades in the simulation began to spin, the vibration in the seat syncing with the memory in her bones. The simulated Apache lifted, light on the skids, then rose into the air with the grace of a bird that had always belonged to the sky. Claire guided it with subtle, precise inputs, barely perceptible movements that kept the craft steady as it threaded through the mountain passes. From the observation deck, Kane watched, arms folded, a quiet pride burning in his chest. Below him, the instructors and cadets had gathered, silent now, faces turned upward, transfixed. Gone were the smirks, the whispered jokes. All that remained was awe. Inside the cockpit, Claire's world blurred. The simulation was so real, so familiar, that the line between past and present dissolved. The screen became a memory. The landscape wasn't pixels. It was the valley at red sand. The hum wasn't speakers. It was the tremor of a real bird fighting thin air. A voice echoed in her mind. "Claire, we're taking fire from the ridge." Josh Tanner's voice, young and urgent. She saw it. The flash of muzzle fire from the rocks. The ripple of heat from the barrel of a hidden RPG. She felt again the instinctive dive. The roll that saved them by inches. The sickening jolt as rounds tore through metal and glass. But this time, no round struck. No blood. No scream cut the comms. This was a flight where she could choose the path. Where she could prove, if only to herself, that she could still fly without the ghosts. Claire exhaled slowly, adjusting altitude, weaving through the digital canyons with a fluidity that seemed effortless, but came from years of hard-won experience. The simulated mission called for extraction of a pinned-down unit. She approached the LZ with caution, scanning the ridges, reading the terrain the way a master tracker reads the forest. Every movement, every decision was deliberate. Where others might rely on speed or brute force, Claire relied on precision. She brought the bird in low, masked by the terrain, using shadow and rock as cover. She flared at the last second, settling the skids in a swirl of dust, the virtual troopers boarding in practiced haste. Then she lifted again, banking away from imaginary fire, climbing into the sky as the rising sun turned the peaks to molten gold. The simulator powered down, the image fading to black. The cockpit fell silent except for the soft tick of cooling metal. Claire sat still for a moment longer, her hands resting lightly on the controls, her breath even, her heart steady. Then she unstrapped, climbed out, and stepped onto the hangar floor. There was no applause, not at first, just silence. The kind that follows a truth so plain it leaves no room for words. Then slowly, a single mechanic began to clap. The sound echoed in the vast space, joined by another, and another, until the room rang with genuine respect. Not for a show, but for mastery. Here was the difference between the real warrior and the pretender. The pretender seeks approval, performs for the crowd, measures worth in noise and attention. The real warrior doesn't need the noise. The real warrior lives for the mission, for the team, for the promise kept. Claire didn't fly that simulator to impress anyone. She flew it to honor a fallen friend, to remind herself of who she was. And that is strength, the kind that doesn't fade when the applause ends. When Claire stepped down from the simulator platform, the hangar was utterly silent. The air felt different now, Thick, not with heat or arrogance, but with the weight of what everyone had just witnessed. The instructors who had mocked her stood frozen, their earlier bravado gone, replaced by an uneasy respect. The cadets looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, their eyes wide with the realization that they'd been in the presence of someone extraordinary all along. Claire didn't seek out their gaze. She didn't need their validation. She simply gathered her duffel, slung it over one shoulder, and gave Air Marshal Kane a nod of thanks that spoke volumes. But the silence didn't last. From the far side of the hangar, the young mechanic, Sarah, was the first to act. She clapped once, then again, her face lit not by obligation, but by genuine admiration. The sound echoed, sharp and clear. One by one, others joined in. The applause was slow, hesitant at first, but soon built into something steady and real. Not for the spectacle, but for the substance. Claire gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, then turned, walking across the hangar floor, leaving behind only the soft thud of her boots against the concrete. Sarah watched her go, heart pounding. She'd grown up on stories of heroes, of warriors, of pilots who'd done the impossible. But never had she seen one up close. And never had she imagined a hero could look so unassuming, so human. There was no swagger in Claire's stride, no hunger for praise in her eyes, just a quiet strength that filled the space she left behind. Sarah felt something shift inside her, a resolve, a spark. If that was what a real hero looked like, maybe she could aim higher. Maybe she could become someone who mattered, not through words or image, but through action, through service, through dedication to something larger than herself. Meanwhile, Air Marshal Kane stood still, watching Claire's silhouette shrink against the glare of sunlight beyond the hangar door. His chest tightened, not with regret, but with a deep, abiding respect. He thought of all the men and women like Claire he'd met in his decades of service. The ones who didn't ask for medals, the ones who didn't tell their stories at the bar, the ones who carried their ghosts in silence because to them, duty had never been about recognition. He thought of his own career, of missions flown in the dead of night, of decisions made in the space between heartbeats, of comrades lost and promises kept. And he thought of how easy it was for people, good people even, to forget the price that was paid by those who served in shadows. Sometimes, Kane muttered to himself, the war doesn't end when the mission's over, and the ones who keep fighting, you'll never see their scars, but they're there. He turned to the instructors and cadets, who now stood straighter, sobered by what they'd witnessed. Kane didn't scold them. He didn't need to. The lesson had been delivered, far more powerfully than any words could have done. Remember what you saw today, he said quietly, his voice carrying in the hush. And remember who you almost overlooked. As the hangar slowly returned to its usual rhythm, Kane lingered at the edge, watching the last of Claire's form disappear into the sunlight. A lone figure, walking the path of those who serve not for glory, but for something greater. And as he stood there, Kane made himself a promise. He would tell this story, not in official reports, but in quiet conversations, in moments when the next generation needed reminding of what true courage looked like. Because heroes like Claire Westin didn't need applause, but they deserved to be remembered. What happened that day at Falcon Mesa wasn't just about Claire Westin. It wasn't just about one pilot or one flight or one forgotten hero. It was a mirror held up to all of us, forcing us to look at how quickly we judge, how easily we make assumptions, and how often we fail to see the extraordinary hidden in the ordinary. Those instructors weren't bad men. The cadets weren't cruel. They were simply human, fallible in the way we all are. They saw a woman in civilian clothes, no insignia, no title, no fanfare, and they filled in the blanks with their own biases. She must be lost. She must be unqualified. She must be a joke. How could they know the truth? How could they guess that behind that quiet patience was a warrior who had faced death and brought others home? But isn't that the point? So often the people who've done the hardest things, who carry the deepest scars, don't look the part. They don't wear their heroism on their sleeve. They don't announce their sacrifice. They just keep showing up, doing the work, honoring their promises. In our modern world, where so much value is placed on appearances, on how loud you are, how flashy your resume looks, how many followers you have on social media. We too often overlook the quiet strength that really matters. We reward the showy, the boastful, the polished. And we miss the Claire Westons who walk among us every day. The nurse who stays late to comfort a patient, the teacher who sees the struggling child no one else notices, the veteran who never talks about what he did overseas but volunteers at the shelter every weekend. The difference between a real warrior and a pretender? The pretender seeks approval. They crave attention, applause, validation. The real warrior seeks none of that. The real warrior serves because it's right, because duty calls, because promises matter. And when the mission is done, they walk quietly away, not because they don't care, but because they care so deeply that recognition feels beside the point. What Claire reminded all of us that day is that heroism isn't always loud. It isn't always dressed in medals or framed in certificates. Sometimes it's in the steady hands of someone who doesn't flinch under pressure, in the calm voice that guides others through chaos, in the quiet choice to do what's right, even when no one is watching. And that leaves us with a question worth carrying beyond Falcon Mesa. How many heroes have we overlooked in our own lives? How often have we misjudged the quiet one, the humble one, the person who didn't look the part? Perhaps the greatest tribute we can pay to people like Claire is not just to applaud them when they reveal themselves, but to open our eyes before they have to look deeper, to listen better, to honor not just the loudest voices, but the truest hearts. Because in the end, real courage doesn't need the spotlight. It just needs to be seen. As the sun set over Falcon Mesa that day, the base settled back into its usual rhythm. But for those who had witnessed Claire Weston's quiet flight, something had shifted. They'd seen what true strength looked like. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that simply is. Steady, unshakable, born from duty and sacrifice. And now, we want to leave you with this. Think about the people in your life, the ones who don't ask for recognition, who don't tell their stories at every chance. Maybe it's a neighbor who served and never spoke of it, a teacher who shaped lives without seeking applause, a nurse, a coach, a parent, a friend, the quiet heroes, the Claire Westons among us. We invite you to share their stories in the comments below. Tell us about the person who inspired you, not because they wanted the spotlight, but because they lived with courage, honor, and humility. Let's fill this space with reminders of the heroes who walk among us every day, unseen but never unneeded. If Claire's story touched you, if it made you pause, reflect, or see someone differently, please consider giving this video a like. It helps more people discover these important stories. And if you believe, as we do, that the world needs to hear about quiet courage and real heroism, hit subscribe and join our community. We tell these stories not for clicks, but to honor the people who deserve to be remembered. And one last thing. Next time you see someone who doesn't look the part, who isn't loud or flashy, look again. You might be standing in the presence of a real hero. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And most of all, thank you for helping us honor the silent warriors who make our world safer, stronger, and better.